Peter Herndorf has big plans for the NAC, the least of which calls for putting the National back into the National Arts Center. And joining us now for more, here he is, Peter Herndorf, the president and CEO of the National Arts Center. And I have to say as well, the man who showed uncommonly bad judgment about 21 years ago and hired me here.
One of my shrewdest decisions. Anyway, it's very nice to be back with you and in this studio.
That's what I was going to ask you, actually, first question. Well, what's it like being back in here?
It's you know, it really is quite emotional to be back here. I mean, when you and I and others created Studio 2 here, which morphed into the agenda, it all happened here, and it sends a little sensation in the back of your neck just being here. It's really very nice.
Do you get the same thing? Because you've had a career, let's face it, you've had a career. You had a lot of years at CBC, then you ran TVO, you got Toronto Life in there as well, now the NAC. When you go back to CBC, do you get that little frisson as well?
I do, although it's more complicated because I went back to the CBC as a board member. I was on the board of the CBC for 5 years, and involved in some fairly rugged debates on the board of the CBC about the direction of public broadcasting, and I'm still a great partisan of public broadcasting, but it isn't quite the same frisson that that I get sitting here in Studio 2, but that's another conversation.
Okay. Let me just take you back. The funny thing is I worked for you for a lot of years, but I've never interviewed you really, and certainly never about your life. So, you were a guy who ran a journalistic department. You ran News and Current Affairs at CBC, and then Toronto Life, which again is still journalism. And here, you turned this place really from a place that was much more pedagogical into a place that was more of a broadcaster. Yeah. But then the NAC, which is a really different kettle of fish, I think. Why the virage?
Well, in fact, if you look closely at that period of time that you and I were working together, I had some other preoccupations. I had a volunteer life, and my volunteer life was very heavily involved in the arts. So during the time we worked together, I was for a number of years involved with the Stratford Festival. I ended up being the chair of the Stratford Festival board. I was the founding chair of the Canadian Stage Company and did that for many years. I was very involved with the Canadian Museum of Civilization. So these were all kind of volunteer activities that I was doing while I was in broadcasting or magazines or journalism. And to some degree, it was a kind of a seamless transition for me. And the biggest reason for that, which you may or may not agree with, is that leading an organization that is a journalistic organization and one that's an arts organization aren't all that different.
Because the journalists and the artists are equally cantankerous and hotheads.
They are equally fiercely independent. They are equally passionate. They are equally they're equally creative.
You're missing a word here. The word you're looking for is pains in the ass.
No, listen.
Come on, there's some of that.
There's some of that, yeah. But what was so wonderful for me moving, I think, seamlessly to the National Arts Center was that I loved working with a group of very talented artists there in the same way that I had really loved working with journalists at TV Ontario, at Toronto Life, at CBC. And they were really very, very similar. And if you talk about some of the people that I worked with over the years, if you talk about Barbara Frum or Peter Zosky, Donald Britton, Mark Starowitz, all journalists, but all artists. And the one other common denominator with artists and journalists is that they're all great storytellers.
Great storytellers and massive egos too, yes? Who's got bigger egos?
It's kind of the same.
Good for you. No, that's right, isn't it?
I think it is the same, and there is both a very strong desire to do it really, really well, and some insecurity.
How have you managed to get along with some of the most egomaniacal, cantankerous, self-absorbed journalists and artists over the years? What's the secret?
Well, there are two reasons. One is I admire them, and you have to. I found working with journalists, including wonderful journalists like you, a real kick. I mean, it was terrific. So I greatly admire the journalists I've worked with and those artists, and secondly, it had to do with the kind of impact that both the journalists and the artists had. In some ways, I could help them achieve the kinds of aspirations they had, the kind of artistic and journalistic goals, and I loved it. I still do, and I still get an enormous kick after all these years going to the office and working with a Pinchas Zuckerman, or working with Wajdi Mouawad, who was our head of French theater, or working with Gillian Kiley or Peter Hinton or Kathy Levy, all the others. I get an enormous kick out of it.
High maintenance doesn't bother you?
No, it doesn't. It's part of what I signed up for.
Okay. I'll take you back a decade. When you went over to the National Arts Centre after you left TV Ontario, as it then was, you entered that institution at a time when there had been a revolving door of leaders the previous, 7, 8 years. So when you come to an organization like that, what's priority number one?
Well, I have to step back a bit. This was an organization, a very proud organization with a very imposing mandate given to it by Parliament that had lost its way. It had lost its sense of direction, and the most important thing that I could do for the organization in those first few months that I arrived was to remind them that they were really talented, remind them that they played a really significant role in the life of the country, and with them provide a sense of direction. And that's what I did. And the sense of direction was simple enough that hopefully every employee at the National Arts Centre understood it. There were 4 things we wanted to achieve. We wanted to make sure that the National Arts Centre really focused on being exceptional in programming. That sounds like motherhood, but it isn't motherhood. It's not just being good, it's being exceptional at what you do. Secondly, as you said before, we wanted to put the National back into the National Arts Centre. So we wanted to make sure that we were not a local organization with a Tony address. We wanted to be a national organization. Third thing that they all had to understand is we had to become entrepreneurial. And telling the government organization that they have to become entrepreneurial is kind of interesting. We had to find other sources of revenue to do our national activities. And fourthly, we had to create arts education as a core activity. Before that, it had been kind of a peripheral thing we did. We wanted to make it central to the mandate of the place. Those 4 things. And it was easy enough, straightforward enough that, and I repeated it probably 387 times in that first year, and they embraced it. And I think because the place is as talented as it is, it has great artistic leadership, it's flourished.
A decade later, do you think you've achieved all 4 of those things?
No. What we've done is move down the path in each of those areas. We've done really very well on the entrepreneurial side, and we've done very well on the arts educational side. But in terms of doing exceptional work in programming and having a national focus, that's a work in progress. That's every day you work at it, and I have to, and my colleagues have to remind one another, literally every day, that look, we're a national organization. Stop focusing on the Rideau Canal. Focus on Edmonton. Focus on Vancouver. Focus on Halifax. And in terms of doing great work, you have to. It's a juggling act. You have to remind marketing that look, it's okay to do that really demanding piece of theater for the next 3 weeks. It won't sell quite as well as something else, but it's really important to do. So those are the juggling acts you do. I think we've made a lot of progress, but boy, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be pursued.
Is yours a harder job than somebody who runs, say, a theater company in the private sector? Because you have this added mandate that you have to, in some respects, build the nation through what you do.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons why it's harder. First of all, keeping score is much more complicated. There's a level of ambiguity in the way you keep score that isn't there for a David Mirvish. For David Mirvish, keeping score is relatively straightforward. It's the number of people who attend his shows, and the bottom line at the end of the year. For us, it's much more complicated. But the other thing, as you point out, for us, the issue is that we're really, we hope, doing a kind of nation building through the arts that is important for the country, and important for artists and arts organizations, and the way you build communities from one end of the country to the other. So it's a more interesting and more challenging role than if you were just doing it in the private sector.
So I wonder how you know if you're achieving, because as you say, Mirvish looks at his bottom line and either he made money on a show or he didn't. How do you tell whether you are in fact building the country?
Well, you begin to look at the kinds of activities that we're involved in, and I'll give you an example of something very significant in this season. We've done something this year called the Year of the North at the National Arts Center, and the Year of the North involved a major tour of the Arctic with the NEC Orchestra. And the NEC Orchestra not only playing classical music, but playing the music of the North with musicians from the North. And there was a kind of dynamic that went on through Nunavut and the rest of the North that dazzled people in the North and dazzled people in the South, and began to do some bridge building between the two. I didn't need a complicated way of keeping score. It was clear that there were connections being made between South and North through music that was really impressive. In April, the National Arts Center is doing the Northern Scene, the other half, and we're bringing 250 artists from every part of the North to the national capital, and but it's a North that you might not recognize. It's a North that includes a major fashion designer, and we're doing a fashion show as part of the Northern Scene, and it includes a North that has some really out there chefs, some foodies in the North, and a lot of other things. The North is, again, much more complex, much more dynamic, much more unexpected, and so in that respect, we are beginning to build understanding in the South about what the North will be in this country over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. Now, that to me is nation building that you can reasonably quantify. You can see it happening. Now, there are lots of other things we do, and we can talk about that.
Well, let me ask about politics before we go any further, because one of your skills that has been observed over the years is that you've had to get along with any number of different prime ministers and premiers from all different parties, and somehow you do. However, Prime Minister Harper's made no secret of his love for the North, and opening up the North has been as big a priority for him, as it has been for more so than any prime minister in the past, maybe since Diefenbaker. I think we can say that. For you to focus on the North, is that because he tells you to do that? Is that why that happens?
No, it's interesting that to a degree that has surprised me over the 13 and a half years I've been there, we have never received either a kind of direct or a more subtle message about what we should be focusing on. Now, it's clear that the North is increasingly important to this country. It's not only the Prime Minister that's interested in the North, but all of the parties are becoming more interested in the North. And so in many ways, it was the most basic thing in the world to say, look, let's build some of our programming around the North. But you have to remember that this was the fifth in a series of national festivals that we were doing that focused on different parts of the country. So we started in Atlantic Canada, then went to Alberta, and we were in Quebec, and we were in British Columbia, and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So it's the sixth. Then in the north, we didn't pluck it out of the air and say, look, Stephen Harper would like to do this. The fact that Stephen Harper and Lorene Harper have been very supportive of the National Arts Center certainly helps. But this really has to do with our sense of the country, our sense of the programming needs of the country. And it's interesting that later this year, in October of 2013, we are doing a huge tour of China, 18-day tour of China, concerts throughout the country. I think probably 100 educational events in different parts of China. Again, nobody has suggested that we do that, and most of the funding for it we have generated through the private sector. But it's also true that the government of Canada in the last few years has become very interested in China, rightly.
So there's a kind of a sympathetic.
There's a kind of symbiosis.
Symbiosis, okay, yeah. Or simpatico, or something like that.
But I think if you pay too much attention to what the politicians want you to do, you're probably making a mistake. If you pay too little attention, you're also probably making a mistake.
Okay, that provokes a follow-up here. Obviously, when the Prime Minister wants to play the piano at the National Arts Center, he gets to, right?
No.
He did.
Well, he did, but the story of how that happened is one of those great stories, because Lorene Harper was the honorary chair of the National Arts Center Gala, and Lorene Harper had been in, I think, Chicago about 6 weeks before, and had bumped into Yo-Yo Ma, who was the featured performer on that gala. And she said to Yo-Yo Ma, I'm trying to see if I could persuade my husband to come out with his little rock band, almost like a garage band, and play at the NAC Gala. If he did, would you join him as a sideman? And Yo-Yo Ma, who is pretty shrewd about these things, said, I'd love to. And a week later, Lorene Harper said to the organizers at the National Arts Center, there's a chance that I could sneak my husband out. He plays a pretty mean piano. Would you guys be interested? And we said we would be. And the fascinating thing is no one knew about it. That night, Lorene Harper's date was John Baird. John Baird frequently takes Lorene Harper to these kinds of events. And when Stephen Harper came out and began to play the piano with his band, John Baird said to Lorene Harper, how could you not have told me? So,
she kept the secret.
She did.
I want to ask you the question that I know everybody who makes their living in the arts gets asked, but it's a particularly timely question, I think. And that is, we're running sky-high deficits, both federally and provincially in this country, and everybody wants another MRI machine for their hospital. And they'd certainly love, not to have their kids educated in portables. They'd love real buildings. And when you think about the great, immediate, urgent priorities, frankly, arts or television studios don't necessarily come to mind. So how do you make the case that you're entitled to your share of the budget at a time like this?
Well, I think you have to start with the proposition that no civilized society would ever make the choice between those things. That if you're a civilized society, a compassionate society, governments of the day are going to make sure that those societies include a reasonable amount of investment in education, in certainly in healthcare and in the arts, and so it's never a choice, one or the other.
Isn't it always a choice?
It is not. In fact,
there's finite resources.
If you're a country like Canada, the States, Britain, France, Germany, the fact is all of those things matter to the health of that society. It matters to the mental health. It matters to the intellectual health, to the social health. All of those things matter. And in this country, more particularly, We are going through a kind of unique experiment. We have begun to become a country in the last 25, 30 years that is unlike any country on earth. We practice a kind of diversity here that no one else has done. And the people who can tell the story of what that experiment has been like are our artists. They are our novelists and our playwrights and our songwriters and our composers. Those are the people who can tell the story of that experiment and how it's played out in Canada, and they can tell that story to the rest of the world. And it's a story that has to be told.
But when ministers of finance need to find money, the first place they go is arts. Always.
The truth is that ministers of finance go to all of those places to find money. They don't just go to the arts. They also cut in education, and they also cut in healthcare. All of the ministers in finance, whether it's in Ontario or Saskatchewan or at the federal government level, they all take the view that you have to manage in a kind of smarter way. That may mean smaller, but it certainly means smarter. And but Winston Churchill made the famous line. It gave the famous expression at the beginning of the Second World War. The expression about we're fighting this war because of the arts, because in fact we want a society where the arts flourish in a place like London. And if you go to anybody in France, the arts, French language, it is who the French are. It defines who they are as a people. It is about the health of that society. It also happens to be good business because the French brand around the world is all tied up in the arts, in culture, in products that relate to that.
They got it easier, though. I mean, when you say the French and their art or the French and their culture, everybody knows what you mean. Same thing for Germany, Britain, Italy, pick a country. When you say, what's Canadian art?
I'm suggesting to you, Steve, that in terms of Canadian art, the novelists that we have in this country sell in every part of the world. They define who we are as a people. The comedians that we create, the songwriters that we develop, they're known all over the world. They're known a hell of a lot more than our business people are, than our politicians are, than our hockey players are. These are the people who define the country. They are our kind of storytellers and troubadours, and they tell that story really well. And I'll just give you a very quick example of that. I was in a small bookstore in a part of rural Ireland, tiny little bookstore. I walked in with my daughter, and this guy asked where I was from. I explained I was Canadian, and he said, I love Canada. I just love Canada. And I said, have you been there often? And he said, oh, well, I've never been in Canada. And I looked confused, and he like this went, and he turned to the bookshelves, and he said, I have hundreds of books here by Canadian writers. They have in fact given me Canada. And I got goosebumps. I mean, those writers were the ones who were defining our country to this man in rural Ireland and doing it brilliantly.
Peter, let's go from the sublime to the ridiculous, shall we? Can you send an email yet?
No, but my assistant can.
All these years later, you cannot type out an email and send it yet, can you?
Well, I want you to know that 2 weeks ago, my wife's iPad fell into my hands for a week, and for that week, I manipulated that iPad, and I actually had quite a good time. But I am essentially as much of a Luddite as I ever was.
Okay. Let's do this in our last minute here. You obviously spent so many years of your career working in Toronto. You've now found yourself for almost the last decade and a half in Ottawa. Where's your heart?
It's a very interesting dilemma that I find. The way I describe it to almost anybody who wants to hear is that I live and work in Ottawa and my home is Toronto. I hate to admit this to you, I cheer for the Ottawa Senators, not the Toronto Maple Leafs.
I'm sorry, we have to leave now.
This
Thank you very much.
This is a very painful admission on my part. But I'm still a Torontonian. But the 13 years in Ottawa has made me very partial to Ottawa, and it's put me in a very interesting position of I sometimes interpret Ottawa to Torontonians and occasionally interpret the other way as well. And but I'm a citizen of both cities. I like them both. They're dramatically different, and I have a good time in both places.
And a Winnipegger originally. Any torch left for that place?
I have a significant torch, and I tell everybody who asks that I'm a Winnipegger. But no, listen, I'm a Torontonian, and when I'm finished at the National Arts Center, I'll return to Toronto. But I've had a truly wonderful time in Ottawa, and it's a very vibrant city, and one that I wish more Canadians got to know.
We are so glad that you could spare some time for us today at the place whose halls you used to haunt so often. We used to enjoy.
Haunt is the operative word.
Well, we used to enjoy watching you manage by wandering around, and you did it really well. Thank you very much, Peter Herndorf.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.